Hi, good afternoon, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us this afternoon. We have missed streaming with you guys. We know last week we weren't exactly live throughout the week, but we are happy to be back and we're happy to present with Dr. Goldstein Cole. And I just want to, before we jump into her content, give everybody a second to get the Facebook Live notification and remind everybody that you can find our social media here on YouTube. We're also on Facebook at NH Student Wellness, and we're on Twitter at NH Schools. And we also have our resource website, nhlearnsremotely.com. So be sure to check out all of our resources there. We're going to be going live again tomorrow morning to talk about raising global citizens. But today we're here to talk with, like I said, Dr. Krista Goldstein Cole in a talk titled Beyond One Adult, How School Connectedness Protects Students' Mental Well-Being. And Krista Goldstein Cole is a pioneer in ACE education and ACE-related public policy with expertise in system-level impacts of childhood adversity. As an education director for the Washington State Family Policy Council, Krista built a statewide community education system to support volunteers, service providers, and elected and appointed officials in integrating developmental neurobiology and adverse childhood experiences with violence prevention and public health initiatives. She went on to serve as policy advisor on human services and corrections to the Washington State Senate Democratic Caucus. And most recently, Krista earned her doctorate in human development at Harvard Graduate School of Education under the mentorship of developmental neurobiologist Charles Nelson and Martin Teicher. Krista's research is centered on the protective role of school connectedness in psychopathology following child maltreatment. Krista and her husband, Bill, live in Cambridge, Mass., and they have 3 grown children and recently welcomed their first grandchild. So we are so excited. Krista, if you want to take us away with your content, we would love to start learning.
Thank you, Molly. I appreciate it. And thank you all for joining us today. This is my first adventure in interfacing with Zoom plus other live streaming. So I hope that I get it right. And if something goes terribly wrong, I think if you put it in the chat, Molly can fix it for us. So I am going to talk today about this idea of beyond one adult. How school connectedness protects students' mental well-being. And we're going to have 3 objectives for our time together. The first is that I'd like you all to be able to reflect on and discuss with colleagues the potential value of school connectedness for students, be able to detect opportunities for school connectedness within your own classrooms and schools, and finally make a commitment to incorporate 1 or more classroom or school strategies for connectedness. So those are our goals today, and we're going to get there through the following areas. First, we're going to talk about belonging and connectedness and what that is, both from your perspective and from some perspectives in the literature. Not everyone thinks the same things on this front. Secondly, we're going to talk about mental health as a developmental process. Then we'll talk about school connectedness as a protective factor and what that means. We'll look at some classroom strategies that advance school connectedness, and finally give everyone an opportunity to think about their commitments moving forward. So let's start with this idea of belonging and connectedness. The need to belong and feel connected with others is something that is central to being human. It's one of the things that distinguishes mammals generally from other species, and it definitely sets humans apart in various ways. Baumeister and Leary are philosophers who argue they're sort of the godfathers of belonging theory. And they argue that belonging is both essential and a universal human need. So when we don't have belonging, what happens is that we have psychopathology. So I'm going to ask each of you to just take a moment to reflect. If we were all together in one room, we'd probably do think, pair, share. But instead, I'm just going to ask you to take a moment to reflect and ask yourself, what is it to belong? And what is it to belong at school? And make note of your ideas. And while you're taking that time, I'm going to put up a slide that has 4 quotes on it, that some of which are very well known and sort of reflect different ideas about connectedness and belonging inside of Western culture. And you can use any of these to start your thinking, or just start from wherever you're at and take a moment to reflect on what belonging and connectedness mean to you.
If you don't mind, if I reflect a little bit, Krista.
Sure.
I really like the last quote. It's so simple. The opposite of addiction is human connection. And I think that's just a really powerful way of thinking about it. I love that quote.
Yeah, it's a lovely quote. And it's part of a broader article that is also wonderful. So for those of you that I can't see and whose voices I can't currently hear, it would be terrific if you could just jot. It's my understanding that you can use the chat on YouTube, and it would be terrific if you could add one thing, one sort of reflection you have about connectedness and belonging, and just put it into the chat. And then be sure to read at least one other person's reflection.
So I'll post for people to write their feelings about connection. We can probably move along. We're not having too much movement in the chat right now.
We'll just give it another 30 seconds in case someone wants to post. So connectedness and school connectedness in particular is something that's been very well studied over the years in a variety of ways. And so I'm just going to go over some of the things that we see in the literature about school connectedness. The first is that it is an idea that has many names. In 2005, Libby wrote this article in which she described all the different words that people have used to express this idea of being connected to school. And it includes school attachment, school belonging, school bonding, school engagement, and in some cases, motivation. And all those different words, all those different expressions have 2 common features. And that is that it's the student's sense of belonging at school. So it's from the student's perspective, and it's comprised of 2 things. It has affective relationships, that's how we relate to teachers and peers, and commitment to learning at school. So the ways that we show our sort of pro-school values by coming to school, doing homework, participating in activities, following directions, those kinds of things. And over time, school connectedness has been associated with a number of positive outcomes that we want for kids. So for example, the more school connectedness that kids report, the less likely they are to drop out of school. The more school connectedness kids report, the less likely they are to engage in delinquency or substance abuse. And the more school connectedness that kids report, the better their mental health, and specifically, the less depressed and the less suicidal they are. So it is a very important feature of kids' lives. So now we're going to talk a little bit more about mental health as a developmental process. And I'm going to bring these things together. We've talked a little bit about school connectedness. We're going to talk a little bit about mental health. Then I'm going to bring those things together when we get to the part about a protective factor. So There are lots of ways to think about developmental processes, but when it comes to mental health, the sort of primary way of thinking about that is as developmental cascades. And the folks who coined this term developmental cascades really did mean to refer to this type of waterfall that you see here in this picture, where the water sort of falls over different rocks, and it sort of joins together in one place and goes different directions and comes back together again. And the reason that they drew on this image is because a building block in one domain, for example, cognition, is going to affect what happens in a different domain, like behavior. And that may be at the same time, or it may be at a future time. So a kid who's not doing very well cognitively, who's not really learning at school, may develop behavior problems down the line because school just gets to be too hard, and it's hard to sit still, and it's hard to follow the rules, right? So when it comes to mental health disorders, they tend to occur in this way, where some upstream building blocks get laid down, and for some kids, then that cascades into some other building blocks that cause more problems. But for some kids, the water goes a different direction, it gets resolved. So I'm just going to give you this example here of how that works with child abuse and neglect. So when kids experience child abuse and neglect, there are 6 or 7 domains, developmental domains, where that may show up. And one of them is what's called biological embedding. And this is where there are changes in the brain, in the epigenome, in the gut microbiome, in the immune system, in the endocrine system. And as a result of those adaptations that occur, kids may encounter some mental health problems. So for example, if maltreatment occurs in the right developmental period, kids may actually get a ramped up amygdala. The amygdala is the fear center of the brain. And when we're under a lot of stress as children, we actually grow a bigger, more sensitive amygdala. And therefore we become more anxious, and we get really good at being anxious. And in the end, that results in anxiety for some kids. Another domain in which child abuse and neglect really has important impacts is in attachment. Attachment is often just thought of as the relationship between a child and their caregiver, but it's more than that, because it is the way in which kids come to understand 2 things. One is what their identity is. Where is the edge around me as a person versus my caretaker as a person? And that's important, because if I don't know where the boundary is between you and me, then it's really almost impossible for me to have boundaries, right? To find them by myself. The second reason that disorganized attachment is so important is because when children have a disorganized relationship with their parent, that becomes their blueprint for how they think relationship is supposed to work. And I think it's Cicchetti who says it becomes difficult for children to understand relationships as anything other than coercion and aggression. So you can see where that might cascade into problematic behaviors at school, difficulties with peers, difficulties with discipline, etc. The third area is affect regulation, meaning my ability to control and regulate my own emotions. And part of that happens because when babies are born into the world, if you've ever had a baby, you know this, like they just can't regulate themselves. They get very upset. They need their parents to calm them and soothe them. And that part of that caregiving, soothing a baby, is co-regulation. Like we regulate together, the baby borrows my calmness and calms down, and then eventually the child learns to do that for themselves. When parents are abusing and neglecting, that co-regulation never happens. And so there's actually a deficit in that area of development. And certainly if you've ever had students in your classroom have melted down completely or become extremely reactive, you know what that looks like, right? There are behavioral control challenges, and it's not hard to imagine this. If someone is beating on you, that you might become aggressive. On the other hand, kids do also become very withdrawn. Uh, and in either of those cases, it's difficult then to control, for me to control my own behavior, right? I'm either aggressively sort of pushing my elbows and fists around, or I'm completely withdrawn and either not able to connect with the people around me, or in the alternative, completely dependent. Um, I remember when I was a high school teacher, I had some students who would literally like pull on my sleeves when they like it was time to turn in work. They'd pull on my sleeves and be like, "Is this right? Is this? Did I staple it right? Did I do it right? Right?" That kind of dependence. Um, we also see cognition and attentional issues. I like to think about this as kids who are in danger tend to be hyper vigilant. They're always paying attention. They're always looking for danger, 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 danger. Um, and that's because sitting still is a sitting duck for them. And so attention becomes very difficult. Um, there's difficulty with self-concept. If I can't have an identity and I don't know where the boundaries are around me, it's hard for me to imagine myself as an actor in the world. It's hard for me to understand agency. It's hard for me to have goals. And those things will then become more difficult, and they'll show up as a cascade when I need to be autonomous, but I don't know how to do that. And then finally is dissociation. And dissociation is that just that process by which it's difficult to connect physical existence with emotional existence, which has lots of consequences in terms of kids being prone to injury, etc. So if you have questions, we can pause for a second and you can post them. I think what we decided, Molly's is right, we'll ask people to post questions now. But if you think of them later, just put them up in the chat, and towards the end, Molly will read those to me so that we can try to get those answered.
Absolutely. A few people commented one really liked the quote about human connection, and another just acknowledgement that while we're in this time of physical distancing, the being connected to community is so important right now. So
it is, and it's so hard, right? It's very difficult for us right now, and it's very difficult for kids, even littles, right? Even toddlers are accustomed to having a routine. Kids that go to daycare, they're accustomed to that routine. They're accustomed to seeing certain people every day. That they're accustomed to the kinds of food that they have at daycare, and where you hang up your coats and you put your shoes and take your nap, and all of that has changed for kids as well. So it's equally challenging for them, I think.
absolutely. I think one thing I'm constantly questioning and really thinking about is how do we get them reconnected as we kind of re-enter into, reopening or a new normal.
What I hope happens is as we go through and we start to talk about strategies for school connectedness, that folks will begin to think about what they might do. And when we get to that last step of commitments, I'm hoping that you all will think about at least one or two things that you can do as you try to get your kids reconnected to school, whenever that startup takes place. I think New Hampshire's a little bit ahead of us. I'm down in Boston, and today is our first day where non-essential businesses can be open. So it's a big day in Boston.
That's awesome. Yeah.
Okay, so we are now in our roadmap. We're at the place where we're going to talk about school connectedness as a protective factor. So we talked a little bit about school connectedness as being a student sense of belonging that's comprised of their affective relationships as well as their commitments to learning. And we've talked a little bit about the risks that are presented by maltreatment. Now we're going to talk a little bit about about protective factors. So as I told you before, school connectedness predicts many mental health outcomes. So that means that the more school connectedness that kids report, the less depression and anxiety that they report. When you look at a population as a whole, the more school connectedness there is in that population, the lower the odds ratios of suicidal ideation in adolescents. And then this next thing from Shokit et al. In a 2-year longitudinal study, poor mental health did not predict school connectedness, but school connectedness did predict mental health. And the reason that that's important is it means that that it's not being depressed that's getting in the way of kids getting connected to schooling. But when they are connected to school, then you see less mental health. So it helps us to understand a little bit about the causality. And then the final thing here is that it's the perception, it's the student's perception of school connectedness that predicts future emotional health. And that's a little bit important because there have been a couple of studies that have demonstrated that teachers are not the best assessors of students' sense of connectedness. Where you ask students how connected they are, and you ask teachers how connected students feel, teachers are not very accurate in choosing the way that kids choose. So teachers tend to think that kids who see themselves as disconnected are actually connected. So that leaves us with this question: when you have these inverse relationships, does that mean that school connectedness is a protective factor? And the simple answer to that question is not necessarily, because a protective factor is actually something that happens in the face of an actually specified risk. So that's the reason I introduced child maltreatment here. Childhood maltreatment is a risk. Let me get the little laser pointer. So childhood maltreatment is a risk for mental health. We talked about that before, right? So that's a specified risk. And then school connectedness, these relationships that I talked about, where you have an inverse relationship between school connectedness and depression, for example, is this line, right? And those two are independent of each other. But what a protective factor does is it interacts those two things. And it looks at whether the school connectedness actually changes the relationship between between childhood maltreatment and mental well-being, changes the relationship between school connectedness and mental well-being when childhood maltreatment is present. And so it means the effects will be bigger for those kids who have maltreatment, right? Because if you're here in this box and someone has zero maltreatment, maltreatment times school connectedness is always going to be zero, right? So this won't happen. But if maltreatment is very high and school connectedness is very high, you multiply those things and you see a big effect, right? But if maltreatment is high and school connectedness is zero, you'll see zero effect, right? And so the idea of a protective factor is that it actually suppresses this risk. It suppresses the actual risk. And then it's a little bit technical, but I'll show you what it looks like. I'll show you some graphs and you'll be able to see. So the first thing that I did in my research was to build a model of school connectedness and to try to figure out what is school connectedness made of in a way that we can measure it. Up till now, school connectedness has never been measured in elementary school, and it's not typically measured retrospectively, which is a little bit of a problem when we study maltreatment. So I had this very large survey that involved a lot of things that the literature suggests might be protective factors that, like school connectedness, have an inverse relationship to mental health. And I used that data and was able to produce this 5 indicator modeled school connectedness. So together, these 5 things make up school connectedness. It's adults praised effort and accomplishments, warm relationships with peers, adults model learning and scholarship, motivated to do well at school, and ask trusted adults for help when needed. And those are the 5 things that make up school connectedness. This is here just in case that we have any math teachers or folks who are doing their own research. These are the model fit statistics, which let us know that this model actually does fit. And this is for grades, this is for K to 12. But what I also did was look at just elementary school, just middle school, and just high school, because that allows us to break it down further and see, is middle school connectedness the most important thing? Is that the thing that does the heavy lifting in protecting kids? That, in fact, has been the theory for a long time, but not the result that I got, as you will see in just a minute. So I want to talk just a little bit about drilling down into the classroom level. So child maltreatment is sort of big and conceptual in a lot of ways, and it's hard to know whether it's showing up in your classroom unless you have an individual kid where you're doing mandated reporting for that child. So I just want to give you a little bit of a sense of the scope here. So each year there are about 683,000 substantiated cases of child maltreatment in the United States. And that means that someone has called CPS, the child welfare system, and made a report, and the CPS system has done an investigation and has found evidence that rises to the legal standard to demonstrate that there has been severe physical abuse, there has been severe neglect, or if there's been sexual abuse or sexual trafficking of a child. There are about 2 million or over 2 million calls to child protection each year, and those calls are related to over 8 million children and youth. And the result of that is that on any given day in this country, there are almost 500,000 children in foster care. So those kids in foster care are kids who not only is there substantiated evidence of child maltreatment, but the children are viewed to be in imminent danger of serious injury or death. And so they're removed from their homes. We know that there is significant underreporting for a variety of reasons. So for example, CPS cannot just reach out and come to people's homes and say, let's see what's happening with the kids here. There actually has to be a report from someone in the community. About 20% of all reports to CPS come from educators. And one thing we do know in this time of COVID is that just like summertime, we've seen a very substantial drop-off in reports to CPS. But the evidence is suggesting that for kids who are victims of child maltreatment, it is becoming both more frequent and more intense for those kids as they're spending 24/7 with their abusers. There has been about a 20% increase in calls related to sexual abuse to the RAIN hotline, and they have worked out some procedures to bring in law enforcement in those cases. But we do know from sort of rough statistics that kids are having a hard time now, and they are definitely going to bring that into the classroom when they come back in the fall or next spring or whenever it is that we restart school. We do know that 75% of children who are injured by maltreatment are never reported to formal systems. And we also know that only 4% of all referrals to the CPS system include any form of maltreatment that's not physical abuse, neglect, very serious neglect, or sexual abuse. So verbal abuse, nonverbal emotional abuse, medical neglect, those kinds of things tend not to show up in the formal system. And just to scale it to the classrooms, about 1 in 25 children, so one per classroom, has been harmed, their development has been harmed by child maltreatment, and 1 in 53 children, so 1 out of every 2 classrooms, have actually been seriously injured by maltreatment. So when I say maltreatment, I mean something very specific. I have in my research, and the research that I'm showing you used the maltreatment, abuse, and chronicity of exposure tool, because it allows us to look at timing, severity, and accumulation of maltreatment over the course of childhood from age 1 to 18. And that consists of nonverbal emotional abuse, which are all those things of like refusing affection and isolating children, either by, there's a question on the questionnaire that's about like, were you ever locked in a garage or a basement or a closet? So those kinds of things. Physical abuse, sexual abuse, verbal abuse is the use of words in ways that make children feel unwanted, unloved, or like they are problematic, either because there's something inherently wrong with them or because they just, it's just disturbed everyone's life for them to be there. Emotional neglect, physical neglect, witnessing the abuse of a sibling, and witnessing interpersonal violence. And these 8 forms of maltreatment came to be on the MACE because the developmental neurobiology, the Developmental Biopsychiatry Research Center at McLean Hospital here in Boston has demonstrated that each of these forms of maltreatment are associated with adaptations in the brain, such as the growth of the amygdala, which I described before. So when we take these kinds of maltreatment and put them into, let me just go back real quick here. When we take these types of maltreatment and we put them into this model and we use the school connectedness model that I showed you, what happens? I'll show you a couple of examples of what came out of that. And don't worry, I'll explain it. Although I'm sure that there may be some math people out there who are very excited to see this. So what this graph is the slope. So this line, these lines are showing us the strength of the relationship between the well-being scale and the number of types of maltreatment. But then you see this funny thing where you see like -0.5. How do you have -0.5 types of maltreatment? Well, you don't. These are standardized. I standardized these, which means these are standard deviations. So 0 means the mean number, the average number of kinds of maltreatment that people in this survey, the 349 people in this survey, reported having experienced between ages 1 and 18. And that number is about 2.3, right? And so this is having a half a standard deviation less than that, and this is 1 full standard deviation less than that. This is a half a standard deviation higher, 1 full standard deviation higher. Likewise, this is the mean. This is the average score for well-being. This is a half a standard deviation above, half a standard deviation below that mean. The reason we do that is because the well-being scale and the maltreatment scale are not the same, right? Like the well-being scale goes 0 to 6, the maltreatment scale goes 0 to 8, but they're not the same, right? So how do you understand what they mean? So we put them into standard deviations, so that the stats nerds can be happy with the scale. The lines actually look exactly the same if you don't change the scale. Just tell you. But what we see here is this middle line, this light gray colored line. This is what happens if you just have the mean amount of school connectedness in elementary school. So basically, as the number of forms of maltreatment gets bigger, the amount of mental well-being goes down a little bit when you have the mean amount of school connectedness during elementary school. But up here, what you see with this dashed line is that when you have a high level of school connectedness, that well-being doesn't go down that much, right? It doesn't go down as much as it does with average. But here, when school connectedness is low in elementary school, you see this precipitous drop off in the relationship, right? So that these people start where they're about a quarter of a standard deviation above the mean, but as the number of types of maltreatment increases, you get this bigger drop off, right? So that if if someone has low elementary school connectedness, they're like 3/4 of a standard deviation below the average on mental well-being, whereas someone who has high school connectedness but the same amount of maltreatment is at about a little bit above average, right? So you can see that there's a huge difference when school connectedness is bigger. So that this is elementary school connectedness when you're looking at maltreatment across the lifespan. This is elementary school connectedness with these are just exemplars that I'm providing to you. This is elementary school connectedness when physical neglect occurs in high school. So what that means is that the abuse is coming after the school connectedness. And we still see protection, right? We still see protection. We see that when kids had high connectedness, high elementary school connectedness, they actually get, they say, I mean, that the slope on that is almost flat. So there's no difference in their mental well-being as the severity of physical neglect in high school increases. But for young people who had low school connectedness when they were in elementary school, if they're subsequently physically neglected during the high school years, you get this huge drop off in mental well-being. So what I found is that there were lots of ways, lots of different relationships in which school connectedness provided protection. But the most powerful relationship was elementary school connectedness. And elementary school connectedness protected against the lifelong accumulation. It protected mental well-being when maltreatment occurred in elementary school. It provided some protection in against middle school maltreatment, and it provided some protection against high school maltreatment, so against future maltreatment. So it's a very, very powerful protective factor. It's just that we've actually never studied elementary school connectedness before, because the theory has always been that school connectedness becomes salient. So it becomes important to how kids develop when they're in middle school and they start relating more to their peers. But this suggests that really being connected at school and feeling like you have belonging at school, as expressed through teachers, the adults praising both effort and accomplishment, having warm relationships with peers, having teachers who model scholarship and learning, being motivated to learn, and then being able to ask trusted adults for help really makes a difference in kids' lives. So I know I've covered really a lot. So you might have some questions, or Molly might have some questions at this point before we go on and talk about classroom strategies.
Well, I think my question, which you just beautifully answered, was, school connectedness is expressed how? And like you said, through simply recognizing effort. Because immediately when I think school connectedness, I'm thinking, okay, now we have to join, the t-ball team and the brownies troop and all those other types of things. But like you said, it's as simple as praising effort and those types of noticing.
So that's a really interesting point, Molly, because there is a strand of the research that really does look at those extracurricular things. And I included extracurricular joining teams, doing arts activities like drama band, dance, theater, those kinds of things, as well as clubs in the modeling. And what happened from a statistical point of view is that those items formed their own factor. So there, it's extracurricular involvement is its own construct, and it may be protective, but I didn't evaluate it. But statistically, it formed its own. It's its own thing, at least in this sample.
Yeah, I mean, that's, it's interesting to think about the power of just, some words to help kids buffer some of these maltreatment experiences. So
Yeah,
it's hopeful.
good.
Yeah.
I'm happy to hear that because for a long time in my career, I just talked about the maltreatment side, and people were always depressed when I was finished. So
No, I'm definitely feeling hopeful.
awesome. Awesome. Okay. Should I move on or are there questions?
Yeah, I will keep watching the chat. We don't have many questions right now,
Okay.
but definitely let's keep moving forward. I love this content.
So next we're going to talk about classroom strategies to advance school connectedness. I do hope that everyone who's participating sees that there are advantages for children, particularly the most vulnerable children, in having us as adults think about how we can advance school connectedness. So the first thing I want to say is that school connectedness is absolutely integral to motivation. They're really interesting motivation studies out there. There are studies that indicate that connectedness and feeling belonging is actually a prerequisite to learning. So, for example, if you look at Maslow's hierarchy, belonging comes before engagement in learning. Finn in the 80s had this extraordinarily beautiful model, which he called the identification participation model, where identification is coming to identify with school and feeling like you belong there, and the school gets you and that you understand what you're supposed to do while you're at school. And the kids who ended up dropping out were the kids who didn't feel like they identified with school. So that's why identification, participation. So we think that connectedness is probably a prerequisite to being able to learn. We do know that motivation follows from a sense of belonging or a sense of membership, and that's been demonstrated a few times. We know that school connectedness is associated with academic performance, so grades and test scores, as well as persistence. And we also know that teachers tend to provide support and autonomy to students who are visibly motivated at the beginning of the term. And this is an important point because kids who've been maltreated um, may have a very anxious affect because it feels dangerous to have to sit still. They may be a little bit belligerent because they haven't worked out authority. They may have difficulty regulating their own behaviors and need some assistance with co-regulation. And so those kids, I mean, I taught high school, I saw 160 kids in a day. Like, it's exhausting, right? It can be exhausting with those kids. And so there have been these interesting observational studies led by Skinner that show that when students come in at the beginning of the term, the ones who look like they're ready to learn and who are motivated and engaged early on get teacher support. And that is teachers taking time to ask questions and answer questions. It also is teachers giving autonomy to students in terms of their learning. And over time, those students become more motivated. Teacher support results in more motivation. Kids who don't get teacher support by way of relationship and help become less motivated over time. And so that bifurcation gets wider, that distance between students in terms of motivation gets wider over time. So that brings us to the first component of school connectedness as I measured it, and that is adult praise, effort, and accomplishment. And what we know from Dweck's work on growth mindset is that praise of effort alone does not promote learning, right? It's sort of a feel-good strategy. So when we praise effort, we need to do so in the context of a goal. I really saw you working hard today, Molly, and I appreciate that because that's going to help you get this work done and really help you master this content, right? I really appreciated that you were paying attention today, Molly, because that is going to help us. That's going to help you really master this content, right? I appreciated that you were able to engage with your peers doing the work so that you can all support each other in learning, right? So promoting effort in the context of learning. I will tell you that there was also an item on the survey that was about receiving praise just for accomplishment. And in statistical terms, it didn't load. So in other words, it wasn't as powerful as praising both effort and accomplishment. And finally, it's likely protective because in order to praise someone's effort, we actually have to see them, right? In order to be able to say what the effort is and to put it in the context of the goal that we're trying to achieve, to mark any kind of progress, to be demonstrating care for what may be areas, weak spots that a student has, means that we actually have to pay attention to who the student is, and we have to actually see them. And when we stop and say, hey, I'm so glad that you made it to class today. I mean, I taught high school, and there, 8 o'clock came early for some of those students, right? Especially kids who had to get on a bus at 7 o'clock in the morning, right? That was super early for them. And so, being able to say, hey, I know morning's not your best time, but I'm really happy to see you in class this morning means that we really do have to see them. We really do have to be able to track on what's happening with them. So that's likely the reason that it's effective. Second item in the model is warm relationships with peers. I think that one probably speaks for itself. The third is adults model scholarship and learning. And so part of what this tells us is that this sage on the stage, like me just talking all day today, does not promote active engagement, obviously. But importantly, when teachers model the teachers are modeling a growth mindset, right? When they say to students, student asks a question, the teacher says, oh, I don't know, how might we find out together? Or a teacher says, gosh, I'm stumped, I haven't mastered that yet. The teacher is projecting a growth mindset for students. And when a teacher assumes that kind of role, I am also a learner along with you as students, it infuses a kind of equality and respect into the teacher-student relationship, right? It's not a power relationship then, it's about being on a journey together. And Hattie in 2012 found that making teacher learning visible supports the process of becoming one's own teacher. And that is a critical component of self-regulation. So when we step back and think about how hard self-regulation can be for kids who have been maltreated, this idea of using this strategy to help promote self-regulation is quite useful. It may help to explain some of the power of the strategy. Fourth component in the model is motivated to learn. And then finally, we have help seeking from trusted adults. Michael Ungar argues, he has a model of resilience called the social ecology of school. And he argues that one of the essential components of resilience is having help navigating resources, right? It can be really hard and intimidating for kids to find help, to know what to do, to even know there's a solution to the problem that they have, to find out they're not the only one in the world with that problem. Um, so navigating is essential. And for that reason, teachers do need to be familiar with the kinds of referral resources that are available in their context. And that varies from place to place what that might be. Some places like Massachusetts and Washington and Arizona have been really lost really big lawsuits about mental health. And so their mental health systems for students tend to be a little bit better than you might get in other places, just as an example. It's important that help seeking is central to agentic engagement in the classroom. So that means kids developing their own sense of autonomy and their own commitment to being engaged in the classroom actually does hinge on help seeking. And as I said before, kids who have been maltreated tend to present in one of two extremes. Either they're very dependent and they need help with every single thing. You might hear their voices as being kind of whiny. And on the other hand, they may be very aggressive and belligerent about help. So learning to seek help, getting support when seeking help is a scaffolded task that's particularly important to this group of kids. And finally, asking questions reflects curiosity, persistence, or involvement, and tends to draw teacher support in a reciprocal dynamic. So that's what I talked about earlier about teachers answering questions and providing guidance and help and friendly relationships to kids who present as motivated early on. So fostering help seeking, I think, is an art and probably requires that we check in with the students that maybe feel like they are the least involved at the beginning of the term. So now that I think about it, I might have put this slide in a different place, but we're here now. So I just want to let you see what the maltreated experience looks like for students, right? So on average, so I want to acknowledge that for some students who have been maltreated, school is very hard, but for some it's a safe haven, right? It is an emotional safe haven. It's a place where they can shine. It's a place where they can develop their natural gifts and abilities, and it's a very important safe experience. But on average, when we look across kids who have been maltreated, we see that they tend to have lower grades and test scores, and they're more likely to be held back than their non-maltreated peers. And being held back retention occurs most frequently in the primary school grades, so kindergarten, first and second grades, that time when developing school connectedness is most important. Maltreated students are disproportionately referred to special education, typically for cognitive, emotional, and behavioral issues. Because they do have difficulty with self-regulation, and they need a period of scaffolding and co-regulation in order to work that out. They tend to be labeled by teachers and peers as less socially competent than those non-maltreated peers. They have a very high risk of social rejection, a very high risk of peer victimization, and they tend to be extremely lonely. And they are disproportionately referred to the administration for discipline and suspended from school. And I'll just say from my past research, most kids in the juvenile justice system do have really high rates of maltreatment in their histories. So This suggests that we need something beyond one adult. We need to find ways to establish positive cascades and connectedness, and to really build that up. I will say that during the years when I was working on my dissertation, I was so fortunate to be mentored by two incredible leaders in the field, Chuck Nelson, whose work, even if you don't know his name, you know his work. He's the person who has done all this amazing work with Romanian orphans and neglect in institutional settings. And Marty Teicher, who was one of the earliest neurobiologists to really look at how maltreatment affects development in the brain. Um, and both of them would say to me, having one adult in your life is not a protective factor, it's just the absence of neglect. So if a child has no adults in their life to help meet their needs, then they are by definition being neglected. So we don't want to think of one adult as being protective. We want to think of it as like a minimum standard that is not neglect. And we want to sort of go beyond that and try to do the work that promotes positive developmental cascades. So some ways that we would do that is we want to promote attachment, competence, and access to needed resources. These are the three major ways that we understand how to interrupt those developmental cascades leading from maltreatment to mental health disorder. So attachment has to do with the caregiving relationship and having sufficient trust in that relationship to be able to build a sense of relationship and self that's not based on aggression and coercion. Competence, there's a whole field that is about the role of school in that adaptation to school is the most important developmental task, the most salient developmental task in childhood, and that failure to positively adapt to school actually results in a whole lot of developmental psychopathology, a lot of mental health disorder, and that competence is the key to that, because school is the institution that we use to teach children and to model for children what society expects of them. And so learning to read, learning to write, learning to understand what authority is, learning to understand what rules are, learning to understand where the boundary is between me and you so that I don't cross that boundary. All those competences are important. And then finally, access to needed resources. We really can't expect kids to go it alone or to really thrive in an under-resourced environment when they are at risk in this way. We want to advance school connectedness in elementary school because of its effects on later maltreatment. So one way we can do this is through universal design for learning. Universal design for learning, we don't have enough time really to go into detail about it here, but it is a way of ensuring that the school environment is inclusive and that the curriculum is accessible to all learners. And it gives learners the opportunity to learn the same material using different forms of representation and to express their learning, what they have learned, and demonstrate their competence in multiple ways. So like one strategy for universal design for learning is like a stations approach, which I know early elementary school teachers are great at, and is a little bit more challenging for secondary teachers. Although when I taught literature, I used to bring out like sets of 6 novels, right? So here's 6 To Kill a Mockingbirds, and here's 6 One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, and I would allow students to pick which books they wanted to read and form groups in that way. And then they had a standard set of tasks they had to perform both together and separately from each other, and so it worked in a stations kind of approach in my classroom. A second thing that we need to do is think about we need to use what Perry and Dobson call neurosequencing. So basically, the back of our brain is very powerful. That is where our sort of life force exists. It's like, this is the part of our brain that keeps us safe. It causes us to run away when there's danger. It causes our heart rate to go up when we feel threatened, right? And when we feel unsafe, we don't engage in thinking. That's not what happens. We run away, we freeze, we fight, fight, flight, or freeze. We don't think. And then the middle part of our brain is about relationship and emotions and how we relate to each other. And then the front of our brain is about problem solving. And we actually shut down from front to back as we're under stress. So when kids are having difficulty, especially with behavior or emotion control, we need to do safety first, right? We need to reflect to students that they're safe in this environment, that no harm is going to come to them, that we're here to help them, right? We have to take care of safety first, then to be in relationship with them. And then when those things are settled, then we think about how can we solve this problem. So really we have to calm, care, and then problem solve as a fundamental strategy in the classroom. And building safety and relationship are sort of the antithesis to demanding compliance. Compliance becomes almost impossible if you're all the way down to working from the base of your brain. Kids actually want adults to help them with friendship when it comes to school connectedness. This has been replicated a few times, that kids actually feel like teachers could help them learn to make friends and also help them figure out what to do when they've fallen out with their friends or they've made some kind of social error that they don't know how to fix. They actually look to adults to help scaffold those skills and give them advice. And apparently most adults run from that task, but it would be very helpful to them. And finally, to use conscious discipline or other trauma-informed approaches like restorative justice, rather than ejecting and rejecting students. When we send kids to the office and they're suspended from school, they experience it as another form of eject and reject, and it simply magnifies and amplifies the experiences that they've had at home. So again, I'll just take a pause for a little bit of question. Ooh, we have gone over, so I think we'll move past that. Sorry. And just come to this last bit about commitments. And I've given you just a taste of things that you can do, but I'd like you to jot down, if you can, one thing that you want to make sure to remember out of this content, and one thing that you want to make sure that you do either now while you're connecting with your kids electronically or when you get back to school with them. So I don't know what the rules are about having run overs. Sorry, Molly.
Oh no, we're good. We're still live, and I think the chat was spot on. So somebody shared before you even mentioned helping with friendship, that having online social groups or teacher-led small groups might help kids feel safe and connected in this time. So they were definitely right on target with what you were thinking about in terms of COVID-19 and adjusting some of our connectedness ideas.
Yeah, that's terrific. I know there are lots of teachers out there doing amazing things. I worry the most about the kids who are going to come back and transition, like from elementary to middle school or from middle school to high school, without having gotten to touch base back with, the familiar environment before moving on.
Yeah, I think a lot of that work is going to be, perhaps over the summer, but when we come back in, like you shared, the most motivated students from the onset are kind of those students that get the notice from the teachers and that types of praise. So I'm wondering how we can promote that motivation before we come back to school.
Hmm. Well, I think one thing that's going to be important is we're going to have to address the fact that there are going to be skill gaps that have gotten bigger, that there are going to be some students who haven't kept up, because they don't have connectivity to the internet, because they have responsibilities inside their home where they're taking care of younger sibs because parents are trying to work from home, or where they don't have uh, homework help from parents. Parents speak a different language, or are dyslexic, or aren't that great at math, or whatever those things are. Um, or those homes where there's internet connection, but a parent has to use it for work, and so a kid doesn't really have enough access to do their schoolwork. So I think because when kids feel incompetent, and I didn't talk about this much, but the Cook and Spinazzola study that shows the 7 domains of potential developmental deficit. One of the things they talk about is chronic feelings of ineffectiveness, and I will say that uh, I did some work in prisons interviewing currently incarcerated men about their school experiences, and they had very colorful ways of expressing that they felt chronically. They felt like they were incompetent, and they just genuinely didn't understand how come their friends did better than them, how come they couldn't keep up, how come they were identified at the outset uh, as being problem children. I'll just say they have much more colorful language. And so I think that when those skill gaps get too big, people do feel rejected, and they do feel like they don't belong, and they feel chronically ineffective. And so it just breeds anxiety and difficulty.
Absolutely. Yeah, I can see that. And I just wanted to circle back to you were talking about school connectedness with kiddos and skill gaps. I'm also thinking about those kiddos that really thrived during, home the learning from home, and now they're faced with coming back to school, and their preferred location might be remote learning. So how do we reconnect those kids?
Yeah, I mean, I think that, universal design for learning may give us some great opportunities, like really getting deeply skilled in universal design may help us with some of those things.
Yeah, that's a great point. I think teaching as we know it might have has shifted a little bit.
Yeah. Well, I'll also say that when I interviewed men in prison and asked them what we could do to make schools better, it was very interesting because almost to the person, they said we should make better use of technology, essentially for remediation, and enrichment. So that, and their reasoning was that if we're using technology very strategically so that students can be autonomous with their learning, and so they can remediate, first of all, then you don't have to feel like you are incompetent, like only the computer knows what your competence is, and so you don't have to be defensive about that. But also, they said that it would free teachers up to be more attentive to relationships and do more relationship building, which I think is very interesting. So it may be possible to locate computers or technology in the classroom or in a lab, and use at least some teacher time for relationship building. It's a possible strategy.
Yeah, absolutely. I think now we've built out our inventory of technology a little bit, but
That's
just
cool.
by the basic need of having to have kids connected while they're remote. So
That's
That's
cool.
definitely something to look forward to.
I'm happy to stay on and chat as long as
Yeah.
you like, but I do want to go ahead and put up my contact information in case folks need it. This is my granddaughter, Shoshana, helping me write my dissertation. So, you know, we can be intellectually connected at a young age.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. And I'm going to take this time to wrap up. Let me just triple check the chat. Awesome. And remind everybody, I appreciate you sharing your information here. If you have questions, feel free to reach out to either the New Hampshire Department of Education or to Dr. Krista Goldstein Cole. And we really appreciate you tuning in today. And I want to remind everybody to tune back in tomorrow. We're going to be talking about raising global citizens. So I want to encourage everybody to stay well and stay connected. Have a great day.
Thank you.